In this video, I'll give you everything you need to start playing the King's Indian defense with black. Now, the King's Indian is a massive opening system. There have been entire books written about the King's Indian defense. But the intention of this video is instead to give you a crash course. Enough to get you started so that you can start experiencing the King's Indian and start having fun with it. Now, one of the great things about the King's Indian is that you can play it against almost all of White's main first moves. The one exception being if White plays 1 e4. If White does play 1 e4, then you'll need something else to play against that. But the King's Indian has got you covered if White plays 1 d4, or 1 c4, or 1 knight f3. So it's very flexible. So let's jump into the main line. So White plays 1 d4, and your response is going to be knight f6. The idea is to slow down White's ability to play e4. So if White's playing the main line, he'll continue with c4, taking more space in the center, and you'll play g6. The idea in the King's Indian is to Fianchetto the dark squared bishop and castle kingside rapidly. So White will play knight to c3, renewing the ability to play e4, supported by the knight, and we're actually going to allow this. We're going to allow White to take space in the center, which we're going to fight against later. So bishop to g7, and e4 will come. Now, at this point, when White plays e4, it's very important that you respond with d6. If you don't play d6, if you instead castle, then White will be able to push ahead in the center with e5. And this is giving White a bit too much space in the center. We don't want to allow this, so the move d6 prevents White from playing e5. Well, White could still play e5, but it would be a mistake, because now we can look to liquidate the center, trade queens, and actually win this pawn. Now it's attacked twice and not defended at all. If White tried to defend it, then he'd run into the fork. So all this means that after d6, White shouldn't play e5. Instead, White will usually just bring out their knight to the most natural square. And now you can castle. White will play bishop to e2, preparing to castle kingside themselves. And it's at this point that you should play e5. You don't want to delay this. Now, it might look as though at first that this move is not possible, because the pawn on e5 is attacked twice by White and defended just once by Black. But there's a tactical reason that e5 is possible now, and every King's Indian player needs to know this, so let's learn it right now. If White were to try to win this pawn, then Black can win the pawn back by capturing on e4. The point being, if the knight on e4 is taken, then Black can take the knight on e5. So this position is equal, in fact slightly better for Black, as the engine evaluation shows. By the way, if White were to try to give up their knight for an extra pawn, like knowing that this knight is going to be lost anyway, with knight takes f7, well then that actually loses a piece for White, because Black has the strong intermezzo bishop takes c3 check. Now that's removed the knight which was responsible for taking back this knight, so after White takes back, well, Black can take this knight and be a piece up. So all of this means that after e5 is played, instead White will usually castle. And now you can play knight to c6. And now there's two main ways that White could play from here. The first way is to capture on e5 once, and then trade queens. If White wants to do this, then it's always possible. We enter into a technical endgame, but this is something that should hold no fears for Black. In such situations, what I like to try and do is fight for control of the d4 square. If you notice, the d4 square is actually an outpost, so it's a great square to get a Black piece into, maybe a knight. But before doing this, it's usually advisable to eliminate the defender of the d4 square. So it's White to move here. Let's say that White plays bishop to e3. Well, now bishop to g4 looks to eliminate this knight. Let's just show that. If White plays h3, well, that just encourages the move that we wanted to play anyway. we take on f3, and then the knight dives into d4. If we're to take, then we can get the rook into d4, and this is just very pleasant for black. This pawn on c4 is attacked. If white tries to trade off, well, then he'd lose the pawn for a start. If he defends, then that's going to give time to put the other rook behind the first rook, and black is better here. So what white will usually do instead of trading on e5 and trading queens, is look to close the center with d5. Now, at this point we get the real main line of the King's Indian, where both sides are going to have contrasting objectives. The knight, first of all, will go to e7, and white is going to look to play on the queen side, while black looks to play on the king side. So you might see a move from white such as knight to e1, and now we also are going to bring the knight away to enable the key pawn break in the King's Indian, f5. f5 starts black's kingside play. If you need a reminder of which direction of the board you should be playing on, you can look at your pawn structure. Now, the pawn structure in the center often points to the direction that you should be looking to play on. So the pawns point to the king side in this case for black, so black should be looking to play on the king side. Let's see a few more moves. Bishop to e3, for instance, and now f5. White will play f3 and f4. Bishop to f2. Now, we're going quite far into the game here, but if you play the King's Indian at a high level, you might very well get this exact position. This is a theoretical position, and it follows the plans that both sides are trying to carry out. White is going to try and play for the c5 pawn break, and black is meanwhile going to try and push pawns on the king side. And let's just see a few more moves. Rook to c1, for instance. Well, now black should start bringing the knights towards the king side. And c5, this is the pawn break that white has been aiming for. Important here that you do not initiate the capture on c5. Allow white to initiate the capture on d6 instead. So just keep bringing the knights over to the king side. White will take, you'll take back, and knight to b5 is threatening to bring the knight into c7. This is the last point that I want you to remember here. If white tries to bring a piece into c7, then you need to prevent that with the move rook to f7. It's maybe not the first move that comes to mind, but if white gets a piece into c7, it's really bad news. So you need to prevent that. And plans from here can be, for example, continuing to push pawns, let's say h5 and then g4, supported by the pawn on h5. And the thing here is that it's a bit of a counterintuitive way of playing, because you may have heard before that it's risky to push pawns in front of your own king, but in this case it's actually not so risky for black, because we've got the closed center. And if anything, it's going to be white's king that's going to come under greater pressure. The way that this game is going to be decided is that black is going to try and break through with a kingside attack against white, whereas white is going to try and get their queenside play going and try and break through there. So it's a game which is very double-edged, contrasting objectives, and it's a lot of fun to play. So now let's take a look at another way that white has of playing against the King's Indian defense, with bishop to f4, the London system. Now, the London system has become very popular, and depending on your level, you may even see this more often than the main line that we just looked at. Before we jump into the London system, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and click the subscribe button. I do all kinds of content on chess, so if you're finding this video helpful, you can make sure that you don't miss out on any of the future videos that I'm preparing. So we can play against the London system with g6 and the same King's Indian setup. And now there's a key departure point here. There's two different types of London systems. The first is with knight to c3. This is known as the Jabava London system. Now, in this form of the London system, white is often going to be very aggressive. And we need to make a change in our setup here. Normally, in most variations of the King's Indian, we play with d6 and e5, or sometimes with c5. But against the Jabava-London system, I'm going to suggest an exception because white is threatening to play e4 straight away, and we want to fight against that with d5. So now white can't play e4, or at least white will need to prepare it a bit more. Now, as I mentioned, white will often be quite aggressive in the Jabava-London system. Moves like queen to d2 and castling queenside are ideas that you can expect from white. Now, with the move queen to d2, white is potentially going to look to play bishop to h6 and trade off the dark squared bishop. This is going to make white's future pawn storm easier with this key defender removed. So if you play bishop to g7 straight away, well, then you might get bishop to h6. And I don't like this so much because as black, we've wasted a move playing the bishop to g7 only to have it traded off. So if I see queen to d2, I would spend a move playing c6 here. A couple of ideas behind this. If white were to castle queenside, well, the pawn on c6 means that we can start pushing pawns on the queenside straight away with b5. It's often quite helpful to have this pawn on b5 able to threaten the knight on c3. The other thing about playing c6 is it gives white a move where he might go ahead and play e3. Well, now you can play bishop to g7 because there's not the same ability for white to play bishop to h6 because the pawn on e3 cuts the coordination between the queen and the bishop. So bishop to h6 isn't possible here. So what can we do now? Well, I like to delay castling a little bit here in the Jabava-London system because white is often going to look to push pawns on the king's side, so why put the king there if we know that this is the plan that's going to come? So let's say that white plays knight to f3. Well, now knight to d7. We want to have this knight here ready to capture in case white puts a piece on e5. And then you might see white start the pawn advance, and this is why delaying castling was a good idea. Well, let's hold up that advance with h5 here. If white eventually castles queenside, well then we're going to play b5 again, and we're going to be okay with leaving the king in the center for a bit longer and try and cause white problems on the queenside in the meantime. If white also leaves the king in the center, well, I'd still usually look to play b5, just because it's useful to be able to push this knight away. We'll just go back a little bit. If white looks to play f3 and play in the center with e4, like trying to insist on playing e4, then this pawn on b5 cuts across that idea. If white tries to do it, just to show the point, well then we get to play b4. The knight's now got to move, and then we can win a pawn as black in the center. So black is a pawn up and is much better in this position. So the idea of playing with b5 and the ability to threaten b4 is definitely one worth keeping in mind. If white ever tries to stop this with let's say a3, well then a5 is quite helpful because now we've got a pawn to latch onto if white does ever castle queenside, right? This pawn on a3 makes white's queenside position much more shaky. If there's a capture here, well now the rook can get in, so white shouldn't really be playing a3. So that's some ideas in the Jabava-London system. Remember, you can delay castling for a little while because white is often going to play h4 and push pawns on the king's side, so why put the king on that side of the board? And this idea with c6 and b5 are ideas that you can keep in mind. So let's go back and look at the mainline London system, where white plays in a very different way. So in the traditional London system, not the Jabava-London system, white instead looks to bring out their pieces in a more, let's say, normal fashion. Knight to f3, let's say. Black can castle, bishop to d3. We'll put the pawn on d6, going for the usual e5 advance at some moment. And white will castle kingside, and you can see that this is a lot calmer. Both sides have castled on the same side of the board. White might play, well, it's black's move. Let's say knight to c6. White will play c3, looking to establish this typical London system pyramid. White's got this strong pawn on d4, well supported. And now what to do from here? Well, again, like I said, I like to play e5 in most variations of the King's Indian. And it looks a bit hard to achieve here because white has got so much coverage on the e5 advance. So we can do it, though, as black, by playing knight to d7. Not a very intuitive move, but one worth remembering, because now e5 is a real possibility. If white were to push forward with d5, well, then you can just bring the knight into e5, and if there's a capture, then the knight gets onto a strong square. White shouldn't give up their London bishop by capturing like this, because then, as black, we've got an unopposed dark squared bishop and a very good position. The bishop pair on a board like this is good for black. Check the engine evaluation. So what will more normally happen is white will just keep developing, and then you get to play e5. And we're fighting for the center, which is what we need to do as black. The bishop can retreat, and then we can continue with the ideas that we saw in the main line with f5. And now there's actually a threat here that white needs to pay some attention to. The threat is to play e4, which would fork the knight and the bishop. White can give a check on this diagonal, but it's okay. We can just move the king away, and the king is fine on h8. So this is the way that you should be looking to play against the regular London system. Let's go back to the start and check another way that white has of playing and how we can play against it with the King's Indian. Now, if you're enjoying my teaching style, just to let you know, I help ambitious adults at the below 2000 ELO level improve their results in chess. It's the Road to 2000 Chess Improvement Program, and if you'd like to explore working with me, you can click the link in the description below. We can set up a time to chat, I can tell you all about the program, and we can see if working together will be a good fit. Now, let's move on to the next way that white can play against the King's Indian. So, knight to f6, the normal moves that we've seen already. Bishop to g7, and the different move that we haven't seen yet from white is if white also goes for a Fianchetto setup. This is known as the Fianchetto variation. So we can castle kingside as normal, bishop to g2, and we can still play most of the same moves. But here we need to prepare the e5 advance, because white doesn't have a pawn on e4 that we can capture with that tactic, right? Just to show this, white can win a pawn now, because we don't have the tactical way of winning that pawn on e4, because there isn't a pawn on e4 for white. So instead, we've got to play, let's say, knight to c6 in order to prepare the e5 advance. If white pushes on with d5, then we can bring the knight over to a5 and attack this pawn which isn't defended. Normally, white has got the bishop on f1 or on e2 defending this pawn, but because white has put the bishop on g2 instead, this pawn is undefended. So this is the way to play if white goes for that immediate d5 pawn push. But in my experience, this is quite rare, and what white will normally do instead is just castle. Okay, so we can play e5, and if white captures in the center and trades queens, well, this is the kind of thing that we've seen already, but there's a bit of a different way of playing against this. Let's say that white plays bishop to g5 now. Well, white is threatening to come into the d5 square, so this knight is pinned in front of the rook, and if you were to try to kick the bishop away, well, that just encourages white to play their plan and play knight to d5, and black is losing a pawn here. The bishop is attacked, and so is the pawn on c7. So we don't want to allow this. Instead, when you see this set up with bishop to g5 and the queen's traded, you should play bishop to e6. Now this wins a tempo by attacking the pawn on c4, and it also means that if white were to play this plan, and bring the knight into d5, well, then the bishop stands ready to capture the knight and actually win a pawn. So bishop to e6 is the way to fight against that setup from white. But if white doesn't trade queens and instead closes the center at this point, then there's a counterintuitive move and a counterintuitive plan here, which is actually to bring the knight on c6 back to b8 and look to reroute it. The idea is to bring it into c5. Let's just show this. Now play a5 first for an idea that I'll explain in a minute. Let's say that white just continues with, well, let's say h3. We bring the knight into a6 and then eventually into c5. Let's say that white develops more, well then knight to c5. And this knight is quite annoying on the c5 square. White would like to be able to play b4 to kick the knight away, but this pawn on a5 prevents that. Now this is an idea that you can use in different variations of the King's Indian as well. If you have a knight on c5, then you should also have a pawn on a5 to prevent white from being able to push the knight away with b4. White might try and renew the ability to play b4, but in this case we can play a4, which means that if white were to play b4, then you can capture en passant. This is not so much an opening move to memorize, but an idea in the early middle game to be aware of. The idea of playing a5 or a4 to prevent the knight from being pushed away from c5. The thing about the knight on c5 is that it's got some pressure on e4, together with this knight on f6. Now the bishop in this case is pinning the knight, so it's a bit different. I mean, you're going to get all sorts of different actual positions which are similar to, but not exactly the same as what I'm showing here. But hopefully these ideas show you the basic setup that you can go for against the Fianchetto variation. Okay, let's see another way that white has of playing against the King's Indian defense. The Sämisch variation. Now this starts with the same moves that we've seen already. And when white plays e4, remember we play d6 to stop white from taking too much space in the center. And the new move that characterizes the Sämisch variation is f3. Now this supports the pawn on e4 securely and also prepares to push pawns on the king's side rapidly. Now my recommendation against the Sämisch variation is to take on the challenge and castle kingside. White can't attack with only pawns, so he'll need to bring his pieces out. And now play knight to c6. We can delay playing e5 in the Sämisch variation, so knight to c6 instead, and white will often play queen to d2. The idea that white has is to play bishop to h6, trade off your dark squared bishop, and then push pawns on the king side. It's a very aggressive way for white to play, but we can be aggressive too as black. With the move a6, which doesn't look aggressive at first, but it has an idea behind it. For one thing, it discourages white from castling queenside, which is often something that white wants to do in the Sämisch variation. This is going to make it easier to push the pawns on the king side. But with the move a6, we're now prepared to play b5. Now this is a pawn sacrifice, but it's a very sound pawn sacrifice, because if it's accepted, then we've got the open b file and the open a file to attack white along. So this is an idea you can definitely use, the b5 pawn sacrifice. If white doesn't castle queenside immediately, which they often won't do, and they'll just instead be looking to bring out their pieces, well, yeah, knight to e2, that looks like an awkward square for the knight, and it is, but it's also the only real square that's possible. I mean, you could put it on h3, I guess, but then you can just end up damaging the pawn structure like this, and it's going to be very hard to launch an attack with this compromised pawn structure. So the knight really has to develop via e2. And now we can play the very annoying knight to a5, attacking the pawn on c4, which is actually undefended at the moment, because the knight is actually blocking the bishop's defense of the c4 pawn. If white defends it with b3, well, that has its own drawbacks, because now white has pushed a lot of pawns in front of the queen side, and it's going to make it harder to castle on that side of the board with the compromised pawn structure. And if white just continues bringing the knight around, so now this pawn is defended, well, there's a key idea here. You can play b5 at this moment. Now, you might be wondering why you'd want to do this, because white hasn't castled queenside, and therefore, why are we willing to sacrifice a pawn like this? Well, the thing is that this is not a pawn sacrifice. In fact, this is a trap which many players will fall into. I've seen this happen to 2,000 rated players where they fall into this trap and take this pawn and end up down the exchange after knight to b3. Now this attacks the queen and the rook, and if the knight is taken, then the rook on a1 falls anyway. So watch out for that tactic, one well worth keeping in mind. What if white moves the knight to c1, preventing this knight to b3 idea that we just saw? Well, for one thing, the knight is quite passive on c1. It's only assuming a defensive role. It's not undertaking any aggressive operations, and it's also preventing white from castling queenside. Well, in this case, I think we can just keep developing, and let's say white wants to get rid of this annoying knight with a move like b4. Okay, well, the knight can move back to c6. Now the pawn on b4 is attacked, and so white has to defend it. Well, now we can look to open up the centre because white has pushed a lot of pawns, and we as black are better developed, so e5 is correct here. If white pushes on, then the knight can come into d4, and once again, worth bearing in mind, this does not lose a pawn for black. If white tries to win the pawn, they're soon going to lose the game, because there's a tactic which, again, if you're playing against the Sämisch variation, you should know about this tactic. It is knight takes e4. This attacks the white queen, and if the white queen captures the knight, well, then there's the rook to e8 skewer, winning the queen because it's pinned in front of the king. Quite often, white will end up conceding and castling kingside. Like, let's just show some of these moves again. After e5, white will perhaps just look to bring their pieces out and castle kingside. And if white does this, if white castles kingside, then this is a major concession. If you can get white to castle kingside in the Sämisch variation, then black is doing very well, because white hasn't been able to do the plan that he was hoping to do of pushing pawns aggressively on the kingside. This should hold no fears at all for black. Okay, so this is the Sämisch variation. Let's take a look now at the alternative moves that white can do on move 1, the Reti and the English. At the start of the video, I said that we can play the King's Indian against knight f3 or against c4. So let's cover those off now. The English and the Reti are both very similar to each other, so we're going to look at them together because the ideas are the same against both. And in fact, they'll usually just transpose. So we can just go ahead with knight to f6 in our usual King's Indian defense setup with the kingside fianchetto. White will often as well go for the kingside fianchetto, and it may look as though that this is the same as the fianchetto variation, which we looked at previously, but it is different, and the difference is that white has not put their d-pawn on d4. If white does put their d-pawn on d4, then we have transposed. But the separate way that white can play is if white instead plays d3. Now in this case we can play e5 straight away. We don't need to prepare it, as we would need to do if the pawn was instead on d4. Then we'd need to play knight to c6 first in order to play e5. But with the white pawn on d3, we can play e5 right away. Okay, so white will often castle, knight to c6, looking to complete development. And now there's two main plans that you can expect to see from white here. The first is if you see a3. Now, white is looking to play on the queen side. We can tell this because of the direction of the pawn chain in the centre. That points at the queen side, and also the light squared bishop points at the queen side. So that's where white's fortunes lie. So the move a3 is preparing to play b4. Now, as soon as you see a3 on the board, your automatic response as black should be a5. We want to slow down white's ability to play b4. White will eventually be able to play b4, but he'll have to make a concession in order to do it. So let's say you continue with rook to e8. Well, now b4 comes and we can capture, and we've got control of the newly opened a file. The rook on a8 controls that because white had to move his rook over to b1 in order to get his b4 advance in. So further ideas for black here can be to push ahead with e4, disrupting white's center. If white takes, then we can make all these trades here. Don't worry about the ability for white to create a discovered attack against the rook. There's not actually a good way for white to do that. And in the meantime, this pawn on c4 is under attack. So this is a position that you can reach, and the game continues from here. The other move that you might see, or the other plan that you might see from white, if he doesn't go for the queenside expansion, is bishop to g5. Now this move comes with a threat. If you do nothing here, like let's say you play rook to e8, well then white's threat is to play knight to d5, and this pin is very, very tough to break. The pin is on the knight on f6, and the bishop and the queen both need to stay guarding that knight. If you try and break the pin with h6, well then white can win a pawn by capturing here and then capturing on h6. So when you see bishop to g5 played, we want to get white to break this pin straight away, h6. So now if white wants to follow through, he's going to have to capture the knight at this moment before the knight can arrive on d5. And the knight can now arrive on d5, but it's okay. We can just retreat the bishop and look to play moves like f5 and play on the king side, in keeping with the direction of the black pawn chain. The knight looks quite strong on d5, but it's not actually doing anything right at this moment. But just the important thing to remember is that as soon as the white bishop shows up on g5, you need to play h6 to put it to a decision. If it retreats, well then, okay, then we've also avoided that pin that we saw earlier. The key thing is to avoid the pin. So that's how to play against the English and the Reti. Now that you've learned how to play the King's Indian defense with black, click here if you're looking for something to play with the white pieces. The Colle system is a very dependable way for white to begin the game, and it can also lead to some dynamic attacking chances. I really think you'll enjoy it.